Every so often I get a request from one of our members in the community to address a particular topic in the homily. And I got a very strong request a few weeks ago from Christine Roche to look at the notion of food and health issues, not just individual health, but even planetary ecological health. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. And to prepare myself, I found Christine's website and found 2 lectures she'd given to the Silicon Valley, is it Health Initiative or Health Institute? And I was blown away by her depth of knowledge in the topic, and even more importantly, by her presentation skills, her public speaking ability. I mean, I've known Christine for years. I would have thought Christine is a nutritionist, but she sits in the pew quietly every week. So this woman's knowledge of the topic was amazing, and her ability to present it was just awesome. And so I picked out readings, and today, typically being the 3rd Sunday of the month, I do an extended homily question-answer discussion. But at the end of the homily today, we're going to defer the discussion. And after Mass, when we go downstairs for our snacks, Christine and I are going to facilitate a discussion of the topic, and she's going to help us set up maybe a program to look out for better health for our community in the year ahead. So many thanks, Christine, for that. So I have to apologize to John and Matthew for what I've done to their Gospels this morning. I've taken a passage from John's Gospel and a passage from Matthew's Gospel, and I've corrupted them. From John chapter 6. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that's the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up onto the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough food for each one to have even a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 gluten-free, non-GMO barley loaves and 2 mercury-free wild Mediterranean salmon. But how far will they go among so many?" And from Matthew chapter 13, Jesus told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good organic heirloom seed in his field. But while he was asleep, an enemy came and sowed Roundup Ready GMO seed there, and then sprayed the whole field with glyphosates, herbicides, and pesticides, and went away." Words inspired by God. In the 1940s, on a daily basis, Mahatma Gandhi would have droves of people coming to ask his advice about a whole bunch of topics. Everybody from important politicians to religious leaders to just ordinary housewives and farmers. And on one occasion, this very frustrated mother came dragging a very reluctant 7-year-old son with her. And she came up to Gandhi and she said, "Mahatma, I want you to talk to him. He's ruining his health. He's eating candies non-stop and his teeth are all falling out. Talk to him." And Gandhi took a look at the child, this really crestfallen child, and he said to the mother, "Go away and come back in a month and I'll talk to him." So the mother went off and came back in a month and presented the child, a very crestfallen-looking little boy again. And Gandhi waved his finger at him. He says, "Stop eating candy. It is very bad for you, isn't it? Your teeth are falling out. Stop eating." The little kid says, "Yes, Mahatma." So the mother looked at Gandhi and she said, "Why couldn't you have told him that a month ago?" And Gandhi said, "Because a month ago, I was addicted to candy." And that's where I want to start today, because in some senses, I'm addicted as well, and a particular kind of food, sugar food. And so I feel a little bit like Gandhi and that little boy. I'm like the recently converted, or maybe partially converted recently. And I'm trying to work out, what lies ahead. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about my own relationship to food over 72 years. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about food wars then and now. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk about food and its relationship and effects on illness and wellness. And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about commensality. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, my own relationship and journey with food. You all know, because we've been a community for 21 years, that 2 years ago, I suffered a major health crisis. 1 week before my 70th birthday, on the 1st of October 2016, at the end of Mass over in St. Mark's, I could barely finish Mass, and when everybody had gone, I asked Karen to take me to the emergency room up in Stanford. And that began a whole bunch of emergency room visits and hospital stays. I was in complete adrenal exhaustion. But there was a long, long history attached to that. So I'm going to give you a kind of a précis of that. It all began at age 4. I'm living with my grandparents, and I'm going to school, a kindergarten, but in Ireland we didn't call them kindergarten. I don't know what you call them in Belfast, Neville, but when you went to school at age 4, you went to what was called babies, and then after 1 year you graduated and you were called high infants. And we felt really, really important. The second year you were a high infant. The other guys coming in were just babies, but that's how it was. It was organized as babies and then high infants. And so the year I was in babies, it was a non-school, Sisters of Charity, and we're a very poor family in a very poor area. Ireland was a very poor place at the time. But for whatever reason, every Friday, the nuns in their infinite wisdom would bring in a box of pastries and would give them only to the really, 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 really poor kids in the class. I don't know what the thinking was. So it was bad enough that you were poor, but now you're being singled out. So there might only be 3 kids in a class of 30 who got this pastry, and the rest of us are salivating. And I'm really angry with my grandparents that they weren't quite poor enough to have me qualify for a pastry. And I don't know what the nutritional value of the pastry was, but somehow the kid was being singled out, so now he's really, really poor. Everybody's feeling pity for him, and at the same time, envy for him, because he got to have the cakes. So that was my first encounter with food. And for years and years and years after, right up into my adult years, I never had nightmares for some reason or other, but I always had these anxiety dreams, and it was always the same dream. I'd be inside in a pastry shop at the end of a long, long line, and I could see all of the pastries inside the glass. And I'm working my way up, and Ron comes up and he gets 6 pastries. And then Jane comes up and she gets a dozen. And then Bernadette comes up and she gets 2 dozen. And the person before me takes the very last pastry. And I wake up totally, totally frustrated. I can never get up there in time to get one of the pastries. And that continued for years and years and years and years. At age 18, I go to the seminary. If you think airport food is bad, you should try seminary food. For 8 years in the seminary, I don't know what it was like in your time, Joe, it was a disaster. There was one meal at 4:15 every day where they gave us bread and butter and red jam as much as we wanted it. And I filled up 4:15 every day. I was looking forward to this meal. As much bread as I wanted, as much butter as I could put on it, and as much red jam. And that's what I sustained myself on for the 8 years of the seminary. So I got to Kenya at age 26, and I'm living with people who are basically nomadic pastoralists, the Kalenjin peoples of Baringo. And because they're basically nomadic originally, they were beginning to settle down, there were no vegetables in the area, which suited me just fine. So we were on a diet of meat and mursik, goat meat or chicken meat, and mursik. And mursik is a very special Kalenjin drink. It's made from all the vital juices of the cow or the camel. And so they milk the cow into it, and then they put a rope around the cow's neck until the jugular sticks out, pierce it with an arrow, and draw off about a pint of blood into the gourd, and then release it. The same animal is used maybe once every 3 or 4 months. And then they take the urine of the animal, and they mix these 3 together with a special kind of a stick called sinendet, which was burned into charcoal, and you rub it inside, and the charcoal flakes off, and then you keep it for about 3 or 4 weeks. It becomes a kind of a yogurt. So for 14 years, I lived on meat and mursik. And it was really disappointing when I came to Palo Alto that Whole Foods didn't carry mursik. So I come to the States at age 40, and I'm living in St. Albert's, right across the road from Margie and Manny. And I'm in school during the day, so basically I'm there for breakfast and at night. But for a lot of the time, we didn't have a resident cook. And so we looked after ourselves. There were 5 priests living there at the time. So for 8 years, I lived basically on Rice Krispies and half. That was my breakfast, and that was my dinner at night when I came home from school. Rice Krispies and half milk. Then I moved up to Healdsburg in 1994, living out in the forest. And I decided I needed to become a vegetarian. The only problem was I don't like vegetables. And so for the next 8 years, I survived on tater tots and fried eggs. That was my dinner, tater tots and fried eggs for the next 8 years. So you can imagine, what was leading up. And then finally, 2 years ago, came the crash. So at that stage, I had a really, really good friend who's my personal physician for the last 30 years, Ireland Brownstein, a naturopathic physician. And she saved my butt on several occasions, literally from the jaws of death. And she was on my case constantly about my diet, and I constantly told her, I'll eat what I want when I want. And then I crashed 2 years ago, and finally she took me under her wing and started bringing me shopping so I could get real food, and started even cooking foods for me. So she sent me down this morning, actually. I passed by there this morning at about 6:30. She lives about half a mile away from me, and she makes this big, big drink, all kinds of goodies, and it tastes terrible, but it's really, really good, that I slug down as soon as I arrive in Palo Alto on Sunday mornings. So that's the first point. That's my relationship with food. So you wonder why the hell I still survived into age 72. So my second point then, I want to look at the notion of food wars then and now. When you look at the evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens, if you go back just about 20,000 years, basically the population of planet Earth was about 8 million people that lived in little small nomadic groups whose carrying capacity was somewhere between 25 and 40 members, but they were nomadic. They moved around. Now, it's very hard to steal food from a nomadic group because they don't have any. They gather what they want, they eat it when they get it, they kill an animal, everybody feasts. So you can't steal food from a nomad. However, about 10,000 years ago, we developed horticulture. And horticulture is using a digging stick. Now, at this stage, we began to domesticate animals, and we began to domesticate crops of various kinds. So now we settled down a little bit. So now we could store food. But it was still very, very difficult to store food for long times because rodents got into it and weather destroyed it. So it was still pretty difficult to steal food from a horticultural society. But then 3000 BCE came the agricultural revolution, and this totally changed things. Agriculture is where ox-drawn plows can create huge amounts of food really quickly. And side by side with that, we developed glazed pottery, which for the first time ever allowed us to store food without water damage or rodents getting into it. All you need to do is put a bung on the top, rodents couldn't get in, and it was glazed pottery, so water didn't spoil it. So now you could create huge stores of food. Before that, we had invented the wheel also. So you got this extraordinary, the perfect storm. You had agriculture with the ox-drawn plow creating lots of food. You had the ability to store it, and you had the ability with the wheel to transport it if you wanted it. And like all great human discoveries or interventions, as soon as it becomes useful, we weaponize it. And so very, very quickly after the agricultural revolution, we started weaponizing food. And we found there were 3 ways to weaponize food. The first way is to burn the enemy's supply of food. So you raid their area, and you go out into their wheat fields or their barley fields, and you burn the standing crop. And then you raid their granaries, and now because you've got a transport system, you can take as much stuff as you want with you. And then the Romans perfected another technique, which was salting the earth. So after they'd conquered a city, for instance, they'd burned the standing crop, they'd stolen what was in the granaries, they would scatter salt all over the area so crops couldn't grow for maybe 10, 15 years. So you could burn the supplies, you could steal the supplies, or you could salt the terrain. Now, if we think that ended, with the Romans, 60, 70 BCE, we have another thing coming to us. Food wars have never ended. In fact, in some ways, they've gotten worse and worse. We're still engaged in food wars. So you look, for instance, at what we're doing to our soil, what we're doing to our air, what we're doing to our water. What we're doing basically is the soil which was producing all kinds of crops, we start monocultures, where we drain the ingredients from the soil by growing the same kind of crop again and again and again. And then we, instead of agriculture, which was a culture, it was an art form where farmers who loved their patch of land, it was like being on their mother's breast. They were that close and connected with the land, is now replaced by agribusiness, big industrialized farm that don't give a damn about this piece of land. And so the soil itself is being salted in some, being destroyed. They're stealing it, they're burning it, or they're salting it. You take the next step up and you look at what we're done with plants and with seeds. So we've taken seeds, heirloom varieties, that have been 10,000 years in their evolution. Farmers all over the world creating different strains of these seeds. And we've wiped those out and we've created GMO crops instead. And then we have patented these. It's like a patent on life. And then we spray everything, with Roundup, glyphosates, all kinds of herbicides and insecticides, so that we're killing, the plants themselves. The worst example of all, I believe, is what we've done as a nation. Between 1960, I think about 65 to 67, when we were still in Vietnam, we initiated a project, I think it was called Operation Red Hand, where we used Agent Orange. And initially it was just guns with flamethrowers that would destroy vegetation. And then we upgraded it using B-52 bombers, so we could spray entire areas. And the idea was that by destroying the vegetation and the water sources, you'd force both the guerrillas out of the forest and also farmers, so they'd have to go to areas which were already controlled by America. And so in the course of that, Agent Orange is 50 times more concentrated than any herbicide you'll see in a farm. And they spray this all over. By the end of that project, 20 million tons of Agent Orange has been spread over this area. And the result was 4.8 million human beings died from it, and 400,000 babies were born with birth defects. So if you think that, food wars are over, think again. You look what we're doing to the Amazon forest. The latest figures I saw were 2015. In the year 2015 alone, 800,000 hectares, that's the equivalent of 2 million acres were clear-cut, of the forest were clear in 1 year, in order to produce hamburgers for cattle and stuff that would give us hamburgers. So the food wars still go on. We upgraded to the next level, and then there's the assault on not just flora, but on fauna. We're destroying the bee population, we're destroying the insects, the pollinators who've been cross-fertilizing our foods for us, they are being wiped out. The way in which we raise animals. So the average chicken right now, a broiler, who's kind of created to be eaten, they're killed somewhere between 5 weeks and 9 weeks. And they're genetically modified in such a way that they're insatiable. They cannot stop eating. So the average chicken today is 5 times bigger than it was in 1950, when these huge big things with 30,000 broilers in a huge house started. And they're fed with all kinds of antibiotics, because they get all kinds of diseases in those cramped quarters. So they carry salmonella and a whole bunch of others, and of course that works its way up to the chain. And then we do the same with cattle in these feedlots. So both the way they're raised, the cruelty that they experience during their entire lifetimes, and then the manner in which they're slaughtered or butchered, the terror that because they're watching other animals being slaughtered right in front of them. Now we know very well that as mammals, all mammals have emotions, and emotions are biochemically mediated. So when you have an emotional reaction, it literally affects the physiology, the biochemistry of the body, and it creates a vibrancy or a frequency of fear. And that gets passed on to the consumer. And so we're taking that level of torture and mistreatment and fear aboard, very often when we're eating this end product. And then finally, it's like the Christian churches, when we started the Crusades, initially you go out and you kill the enemy figures. You go across Europe, you kill Greek Orthodox, and then the Saracens, and then the Jews in Jerusalem. And when you've finished killing the enemy, you come back and you start killing the people at home. So then we start, when the Crusades are finished, we start the Inquisitions. Then we kill our own. And that's what we're doing in our country. Having gone over with Agent Orange and done it in Vietnam, we brought it back here, and now we're doing it to our own people. And so human beings, particularly in this country, are suffering the results of these food wars that go on. There's this extraordinary cooperation between industrialized agriculture and the pharmaceutical industry. So the industrial agriculture is calculated to make you sick, and then they hand you over to the big pharma, who make you sicker. They're not interested in healthcare, they're interested in disease management, keeping you alive as long as you can so that you can consume more and more pharmaceuticals. And then to make it easier, they have the military to enforce this stuff, and then a mass media who are totally compliant and will give the party line, and then finally a school system, that dumbs everybody down. And to add insult to injury, there's what they call in Washington this revolving door, where people are taken from the agricultural sector, and the pharmaceutical sector, and they're given government appointments in charge of particular ministries until they enact the kind of legislation that favours their own company. And then when that's done, they leave and they pick up their own positions back in their industry. So the food wars continue more virulently than they have ever before. So that's what we've faced in our time. So when we talk about healthy eating, healthy living, it's not just about individual health. It's about what's happening to the ecosystem, to the insects, to the plants, to the soil, to the air, to the water, and ultimately to the planet itself. So that's the second point I wanted to make. Number thirdly, and here I'm going to lean very heavily on Christine's research. I scoured the two brilliant lectures that she gave, and most of what I'd say in this third point is stuff I learned from Christine just in the last week. And so I'm going to look at the food and how it affects illness and wellness. And the first thing I have to talk about then is the whole notion of the microbiome. Now, I'd heard this notion before, but I wasn't that familiar with what it involved. I had this notion that the microbiome was simply a bunch of gut bacteria. What I learned from Christine is that the microbiome, you find a microbiome in every major organ of the human body. It's not just confined to the gut. And she quoted from Hippocrates, who was a Greek physician who lived between 460 BCE and 370 BCE, who said all diseases start in the gut. And in fact, naturopathy was saying that for the last 140 years, going back to the 1880s, the very same thing. All diseases start in the gut. And recently now we're beginning to realize that indeed is true, that there's a lot of scientific evidence. So it is the gut bacteria. And at this stage, having listened to Christine and thought about it, I'm not sure who's me. I've got this 2 pounds to 6 pounds massive bacteria in my body, which is really, really, really good, which totally decides, the state of my health. Billions of different forms of bacteria, all really, really good. And I wonder at this stage whether that's really me, and this other thing is just a taxi cab to carry that around, or whether, this is me, the spacesuit is me, and this is a kind of a passenger that I'm giving a lift to. I begin to realize that, both of them, in some senses, they're the two phases of incarnation. There's a kind of the physical spacesuit that we think of ourselves, and then there's the microbiome, which is in fact is an equal partner in the process. And the fact that there's a microbiome attached to every major organ in the body. It's not just in the gut. And that there's extraordinary relationship that goes on between them. One of the points she made I thought was fascinating was that, when you go, for instance, for a colonoscopy and you have to do a preparation where you flush yourself out, you destroy the entire microbiome of the gut. And then you have to spend the next 3 or 4 weeks replenishing it. And in fact, when you can get good, healthy biome in here, it clears up a whole bunch of illnesses. She mentioned this one case of, I hope it doesn't disgust anybody, of a woman who was really, really seriously ill and for years and years and years couldn't be helped in any way. And then she got a fecal transplant from her husband. And within 4 or 5 weeks, all the symptoms of her illness had cleaned up. And so just by replacing the gut bacteria into healthy bacteria. What I've seen is, when I looked at some of the slides she gave, I'm just going to start to the top of the head and see if I can remember of the different illnesses that are caused by or very significantly correlated with the microbiome. And all of this is really, really well-researched material. This is not some kooky complimentary kind of person making up this stuff. This is really, really, really good research. That the state of health of the microbiome is very significantly correlated with, I'm going to start at the top of the head and work my way down. Brain disorders of various kinds. Strokes, Alzheimer's, dementias, ADHD, autism, All of these related to the state of the microbiome. When you go to kind of the psychological aspects, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, very significantly related to the quality of the microbiome. Coming down further, sinuses, mouth disorders like candida, ear infections, all related to the state of the microbiome. The thyroid, Hashimoto's disease, stuff like that, related to the quality of the microbiome. Coming down further, cardiovascular issues related to it. Coming right down further, adrenals, and that's where I, lost it 2 years ago. I was in total exhaustion adrenally. That's affected by the quality of what you're eating and the microbiome. Joints are affected by it, so stuff like rheumatoid arthritis is very closely correlated with the quality of the microbiome. The entire skin, and so stuff like acne and rosacea, connected to this. So obesity, diabetes, all of these things very closely related and very well researched to the quality of the microbiome, which is basically the result of the food we're putting into our bodies. Now, obviously, there are some other environmental issues as well, but this basically is it. So we really are both psychologically, and physiologically, determined by the quality of the bacteria that we culture inside us. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is that things are beginning to happen. In June 2017, the American Medical Association began to make recommendations about the food served in hospitals. And the American College of Cardiologists also said, yes, we need to look at the diets we're offering to people in hospitals. So just recently, Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill, SB 1138, which mandates hospitals and prisons to at least, on their menu, to provide at least one plant-based item that is free of meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. Totally plant-based items, now mandated in these hospitals. So things are beginning to shift. We're beginning to realize what Hippocrates said, 2,500 years ago, what naturopathy has been saying for 150 years, and what functional medicine has been saying, for the last 30 or 40 years. We're beginning to get the message. Now, I want to add one thing to that to myself, and that's the whole notion of fasting or intermittent fasting. Fasting has a long, long history with humanity. Sometimes fasting has been used as a social or a political protestation. And so, for instance, in 1922, the Lord Mayor of my city in Cork, a man called Terence McSweeney, when we were still fighting, British occupation, and he was captured and he was brought to Brixton Prison in England, and held there. He went on a hunger strike and he died after 72 days. There were two other brothers in my city, ÓLaoire brothers, who went on hunger strike in Cork jail for the same reason, and they lasted 120 days before they died. Mahatma Gandhi did it regularly. When he was faced with some situation in India before and after independence, in order to kind of bring warring parties together, he would go on hunger strike. So sometimes fasting is a method of alerting people, socially and politically. But there have been other uses for it. Meditative or spiritual reasons for fasting. And one of the things I've seen advocated recently is daily fasting, of trying to do your eating, in like a 10-hour period, and then having 14 hours of fast. So if you have your breakfast at 8 o'clock, have your dinner at 6 p.m., that for the rest of the time you're fasting, which is giving the entire system an opportunity to absorb, process, and cleanse itself out. So fasting is another way of helping this process and helping the microbiome. That's my third point. And the fourth point I want to make, I call it commensality. There's a subspeciality of cultural anthropology, which is called commensality, from the word mensa in Latin means table. So commensality is eating together, eating at the same table. And cultural anthropologists have made the claim that somebody can go into a tribe, a very remote tribe, and just watch what they eat, what they won't eat, when they eat, with whom they'll eat, and with whom they will not eat. And just by studying their eating habits, they can determine the entire social structure, just from watching what people eat. Everything you need to know about how a society or a culture is structured, you'll find out by watching their eating habits. Now, I wonder if you got an ET from, Planet Zorg coming to United States right now and studying us. There we are, sitting in front of the TV with a pizza and a Coke, shouting at the guys on the football team, the NFL. And I think, wow, that tells us how American society is structured. How would it tell us about American society? What we eat and with whom we eat, when we eat, and where we eat. And so I think the saving grace for me was, for the last 24 years that I've lived up in the forest alone, 95% of my meals were alone. And although I eat terrible food, often it was just a microwave, stick, a package in the microwave, zap it for 3 minutes, and then go out and eat it in my dining room. At least I did it mindfully. I did. Maybe that's why I survived so long. I would literally process from the microwave to my dining room as if it were a food procession. Yeah, I would light a candle. I always left with a candle, and I had Tibetan bells that I would ring, and I would meditate during the meal. Whatever it was, however bad the grub was. So somehow I came to the conclusion that if we are what we eat, then in some senses, we are also how we eat. There's not just the actual stuff you're eating, but the way in which you're relating to this. That this, in fact, is a dialogue. Eating is a dialogue between a particular food form that sacrificed itself in order to maybe gain a higher consciousness by merging with you. So it has to be gratitude for that which sacrificed its life in order to allow you to live. So the mindset with which you eat may be as important as the contents on your dinner plate. And I think that's what allowed me to survive for 24 years in the forest, eating that kind of stuff. So what I've come to the conclusion is that every meal is a sacrament. In fact, food at every stage is a sacrament. And when I go back to the Ireland of my childhood, when farmers were sowing the seed in the springtime, there was prayers that were offered over the sowing of the seed. When it was being harvested in the autumn time, there were prayers said over the harvesting. When my grandmother was baking bread, she baked Irish soda bread, 2 or 3 times a week. And after she'd kneaded the dough and was ready to go into the oven, she'd make the sign of the cross with a knife on it. So she's blessing it as she's baking it. And then when it was taken out, we all said grace before meals, and we all said grace after meals. So I wonder what happens, when you have that level of connection and respect for the food, and you make it a sacrament, then there's a wholly different relationship of what happens to the consumption. I end with a story. About 25 years ago, there was a city in Belgium which was celebrating its 1000th anniversary as a chartered city. And so they took this great musical composer and asked him to compose music for the event. And he did, but he also set up some kind of scientific experiments. And one of the experiments was the following. As people over the course of the weeks of celebrations were coming to this big auditorium, he had bakers who were baking cookies. And it was exactly the same kinds of materials, same dough, same ingredients, 2 different groups. One of them, they were kneading it and they were fixing it, and then they put it in the oven and they cooked it. And they put a cookie cutter and, created little cookies. And they put a triangle on top of the cookies. The other guys over on the side were given exactly the same materials, and they baked it over there. But they prayed over it and they sang over it, Gregorian chant. And then when it was baked, they put a circle on top. And as people were coming into this museum, they were offered 2 cookies, one of each kind. They were not told what it was. And they were given a simple piece of paper saying, just write down which one you prefer. And at the end of the week, they collated the results. And by a hugely significant statistical difference, the cookies that had been prayed over tasted much, much better to people who had no idea that even an experiment was happening. So the quality of your relationship to your food, as you buy it, as you cook it, as you eat it, is really, really important, as well as the content of what you're offering. So to finish up, as a repentant sugaraholic, because it seems that when I listen to Christine, that the 3 great assassins here, as far as the gut biome is concerned, are gluten, sugars, and dairy. They're 3 of the big assassins. So I want to make a promise to myself for 2019. I want to make a promise to my community, COJ, for 2019. And I want to make a promise to Pachamama, Mother Earth. For 2019, that I will try to be a much better boy as I eat.